It was the morning of February 28th, 2026, when hundreds of American and Israeli warplanes crossed Middle Eastern airspace toward Iran. In the first 12 hours of operation, nearly 900 strikes were launched. Military installations, air defense systems, intelligence headquarters, and the country's supreme leader himself, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was assassinated. The name of the operation? Epic Fury. President Donald Trump announced to the world that the aim of the operation was to destroy Iran's nuclear program, eliminate its ballistic missile capabilities, and bring about regime change in Tehran. In other words, it wasn't just an attack. It was a declaration of total war against the Islamic Republic of Iran, the third largest power in the Middle East. But here the questions that really matter begin. How did the United States, the greatest military power on the planet, end up in this war? Who took the real initiative? Was it an American decision, or did Israel lead Washington into this conflict in a deliberate and calculated way? And what was really at stake when the missiles started flying? Consider for a moment this. On February 6th, 2026, just 3 weeks before the attacks, the United States and Iran had begun indirect nuclear negotiations in Muscat, the capital of Oman. On February 27th, Oman's foreign minister declared that there had been a historic breakthrough. Iran had agreed to never again accumulate enriched uranium and to accept full verification from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Peace seemed at hand, in the words of the Omani diplomat himself. 24 hours later, the bombings began. This is the heart of the geopolitical enigma we will analyze in this video. Why was a war launched at the exact moment diplomacy seemed to work? Who had an interest in destroying this agreement? And did the United States act of its own volition? Or was it instrumentalized by an ally with very different strategic objectives? Throughout this video, we will do just that. Explain what really happened, delve into the historical context that made this conflict possible, analyze the real interests of each actor involved, and explore the scenarios that could unfold in the coming years. Because geopolitics is never just about the visible event. It's about the invisible forces that made it inevitable. To understand what happened on February 28th, 2026, we need to go back a few months and a few years. Events do not appear out of nowhere. They are the result of a chain of political decisions, strategic calculations, and seized opportunities. It all begins, in fact, on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched the largest terrorist attack in history against Israel, killing around 1,200 people and kidnapping more than 250 hostages. Israel responded with a devastating military campaign in Gaza. But what few realized at that time was that Israel was not just fighting Hamas. It was systematically and deliberately dismantling the entire network of Iranian influence in the Middle East, the so-called Axis of Resistance. Iran had for decades built a network of armed non-state organizations across the Middle East, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Palestine, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthi movement in Yemen, all financed, trained and armed by the Quds Force, the international arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Throughout 2024, Israel systematically eliminated this axis. Hezbollah's leadership has been decimated. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh himself was assassinated in Tehran, an unprecedented humiliation for the Iranian regime. The Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, a historic ally of Iran, fell in December 2024 to a rebel offensive that surprised the world. In 2024, during the Israel-Hamas war, Israel significantly diminished Iran's reach in the Middle East, tilting the regional balance of power in Israel's favor. What stood out most was the decapitation of Hezbollah in Lebanon between September and November 2024, which in turn facilitated the overthrow of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad by Ahmed al-Sharaa in December. In June 2025, the so-called 12-day war came. It is an armed conflict between Iran and Israel that lasted from June 13th to 24th, 2025. It began when Israel bombed Iranian military and nuclear facilities in a surprise attack, assassinating prominent military leaders, nuclear scientists, and politicians. Iran responded with more than 550 ballistic missiles and more than 1,000 suicide drones. The United States intervened by intercepting Iranian attacks and bombing 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. After the June 24th ceasefire, Israel had achieved a partial strategic outcome. Iran's nuclear program was severely damaged but not destroyed, and Iran was still standing. Post-war, Iran's currency collapsed, exacerbated by the imposition of new international sanctions in September. The economic spiral led to the start of protests on December 28, 2025, which spread across Iran in January 2026 with encouragement from the United States. Trump threatened to intervene militarily if the Iranian government massacred protesters. The regime did not back down. On January 8th, security forces unleashed a brutal crackdown, killing at least 30,000 people, according to officials at Iran's Ministry of Health. The American response was a military buildup unprecedented since 2003. On February 13th, Trump ordered the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford and its support ships to sail to the Middle East. At the same time, nuclear negotiations continued in parallel. On February 6th, there were indirect talks in Muscat. On February 27th, Oman announced a historic breakthrough. Then the 28th arrived. On the morning of February 28th, U.S. and Israeli forces began joint attacks against Iran, reaching almost 900 attacks in just the first 12 hours of the operation dubbed by the U.S. Operation Epic Fury. The attacks targeted Iranian missiles and air defenses, other military infrastructure, and Iranian leadership. Major attacks targeted Iranian military assets and the leadership of the Islamic regime, killing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Tehran responded by attacking U.S. military installations, as well as energy and civilian infrastructure in the Gulf states. Hostilities have effectively forced the closure of the strategic Strait of Hormuz, through which no less than 20% of the world's oil supply passes. The attacks took place. The Supreme Leader was killed. The Strait of Hormuz was closed. The central question that divides analysts around the world is this: did the U.S. make this decision sovereignly and independently, or was Israel led into a conflict that primarily serves Israeli strategic objectives? Israel has almost certainly defined the collapse of the Iranian regime as its strategic goal, an expansion of its initial goals after the 12-day war of 2025. But does the United States have the same goals? This difference in purpose between the two allies is fundamental to understanding what comes next. To understand why Iran and the United States reached the point of open war, one must understand a decades-long relationship marked by betrayals, revolutions, and proxy wars. This story begins long before the Iranian nuclear program. In 1953, the American CIA orchestrated the coup that overthrew the democratically elected premier Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstalled Shah Reza Pahlavi in power, a monarch favorable to Western interests. For Iran, that moment represented definitive proof that the United States was an imperialist power willing to subvert democracy to guarantee access to Iranian oil. This historical memory has never been forgotten by the Iranian leadership and is fundamental to understanding the depth of anti-Americanism that shapes the Islamic Republic to this day. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah and installed a theocratic regime led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The hostage crisis, when Iranian students held 52 American diplomats captive for 444 days, destroyed any possibility of normalization between the two countries. The U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Tehran, and this rupture was never formally repaired. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the U.S. provided indirect economic, intelligence, and military support to Iraq. At the end of the war, in 1988, an American warship was hit by an Iranian mine. In response, the U.S. attacked Iran's navy. In 2002, Iran's nuclear program was revealed to the world. What followed was a combination of economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and covert operations, including the Stuxnet virus, a joint U.S.-Israeli cyber attack that physically damaged Iranian nuclear centrifuges. For Israel, a nuclear-capable Iran was, and remains, an existential threat, not just a strategic one. In 2015, the JCPOA nuclear agreement represented the largest diplomatic effort to contain Iranian nuclear ambitions. Iran agreed to drastically limit its enrichment program in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. The deal was widely praised by the international community, but Israel was fiercely opposed to it from day one. Netanyahu argued that the JCPOA did not eliminate the threat, only postponed it. In 2018, Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement and imposed a maximum pressure policy against Iran, exactly what Israel had called for years. Iran responded by accelerating its enrichment program, moving ever closer to the threshold needed to build a nuclear weapon. The conflict between the U.S. and Iran became direct in January 2020 when President Trump, in his first term, ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force. The general was the architect of the entire Iranian regional strategy. His death was celebrated in Israel as a decisive strategic blow. October 7, 2023 changed everything. The attack by Hamas, which the American government considers an Iranian-backed terrorist organization, gave Israel the political and moral justification for a military campaign of historic proportions. But the question analysts ask quietly is, to what extent did Hamas act with Iran's full knowledge and approval? And to what extent was the attack itself the planned trigger for a chain of events that would end in the destruction of the Iranian regime? The broader geopolitical context is equally important. The Middle East is not just a theater of religious and ethnic conflict. It is the heart of the global energy system. The Strait of Hormuz, through which no less than 20% of the world's oil supply passes, has been closed by hostilities. Any conflict in the region directly affects fuel prices, inflation, and economic stability on all continents. Another crucial historical element is the global repositioning of powers such as China and Russia. Both have significant economic and strategic ties to Iran, and the 2026 war represents an opportunity for Beijing and Moscow to strengthen their narrative that the U.S. is a destabilizing power, especially as European and Arab countries criticize the operation. The option of the U.S. and Israel to go to war together against Iran is not being well received by countries and the population of the region. These governments and populations are indeed very concerned about the costs of war to their stability, their lives, their economy, and their military capacity. The most disturbing element of the historical context is what happened in the weeks immediately preceding the war. On February 6, 2026, Iran and the U.S. held indirect nuclear talks in Oman's capital, Muscat. On February 27, 2026, Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi said that a breakthrough had been achieved and that Iran had agreed both to never accumulate enriched uranium and a full verification by the IAEA. Furthermore, Iran had agreed to irreversibly reduce its current enriched uranium to the lowest possible level. The war began 24 hours after this announcement. Israel's strategic objective in this conflict is the clearest of all and the most radical. Israel has almost certainly set the collapse of the Iranian regime as its strategic objective. This is an expansion of initial objectives following the 12-day war of 2025. In that conflict, Israeli and American strikes significantly delayed Iran's nuclear program. But some Iranian ballistic missile strikes managed to penetrate Israeli and American missile defenses. For the Israeli government, the equation is simple. A nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat. An Iran that can produce 10,000 ballistic missiles, enough to overwhelm Israeli air defense systems, is also an existential threat. Israel had prepared to attack this threat later, in 2026. But plans were changed following popular protests against the regime in January, when the regime's internal weakness appeared to combine with damage to its nuclear program and the deterioration of its regional position. The possible gains for Israel are enormous. The definitive destruction of Iran's nuclear program, the elimination of the regime that finances all its regional enemies, and the establishment of a new order in the Middle East in which Israel would be the dominant power without strategic opposition. The risks are also immense. a long war, a fragmented Iran that becomes a failed state rife with terrorism, and Israel's increasing isolation on the global stage. There's one particularly telling element. Israel was completely opposed to the negotiations and maintained an unwavering commitment to dismantling Iran's nuclear program. This means that when the Muscat negotiations seemed to produce results, Israel had every interest in destroying them. And the window was narrow, because a diplomatic agreement would have stripped the Israelis of justification for the attack. The American case is more ambiguous and, therefore, more intriguing. The U.S. has declared 3 official objectives: destroy Iran's nuclear program, eliminate Iranian ballistic missiles, and promote regime change in Tehran. But the real interests are more complex. There are good reasons why previous presidents were reluctant to get involved in a war with Iran. Trump ignored all reservations. Now he will have to deal with the consequences of the biggest gamble of his presidency. The potential gains for Trump are the elimination of the greatest strategic threat to the U.S.'s closest ally in the region, the strengthening of the American position in the Middle East, and the possible access to a post-regime Iran more aligned with Western interests. The risks are proportionate. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard could conduct multiple types of attacks against U.S. personnel and regional bases, and the reach could go well beyond the region, including within the United States itself. As the U.S. faces increasing isolation from global allies in the war with Iran, senior European officials have said they prefer diplomatic solutions. Countries like France continue to resist Trump's calls to join a military coalition. Trump publicly criticized NATO, saying the alliance was making a very foolish mistake. Iran entered this war in a position of extreme weakness, with a devastated economy, a damaged nuclear program, weakened regional proxies, and internal protests that killed 30,000 people within weeks. Still, his response was determined and broad. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps says it has launched attacks against at least 27 bases in the Middle East where American troops are deployed, as well as Israeli military installations. So far, Iran has launched attacks in 9 countries in the region: Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. For the Iranian regime, war is first and foremost a question of survival. Surrender would mean the end of the Islamic Republic. Therefore, Iran's strategic objective is to prolong the conflict, increase costs for the U.S. and Israel, and use its proxies and the Strait of Hormuz as instruments of pressure on the global economy, especially on the Gulf countries that host American bases. There is a scenario that most experienced analysts fear aloud, and that governments rarely admit to: the possibility that the U.S. and Israel achieve immediate military victories but become engulfed in a long-term conflict with no clear way out. Gulf leaders are concerned that the lack of clear strategic objectives portends a long war that will wreak havoc on the region's security and economies. They also wonder what the Gulf will be like when the conflict ends. Israel may well welcome the disintegration of Iran into a failed and fragmented state, which would be a persistent obstacle to regional peace and prosperity. This scenario begins with a quick and apparent military victory. The Iranian regime collapses, Khamenei is dead, and power in Tehran is fragmented between military, clerical, and reformist factions. The Assembly of Experts nominated Ali Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, to succeed him. But a son in power does not mean stability. It can mean exactly the opposite: a low-intensity civil war in a country of 90 million people. Iran is a multi-ethnic country with historical tensions between Persians, Kurds, Azeris, Arabs, and Baluchis. A weakened or destroyed central regime can release centrifugal forces that no external power can control. The Kurds could trap Iranian security forces in the West, giving space to unarmed protesters in major cities. They could stretch the regime's resources and reduce pressure on the Gulf states and Israel. And if the Kurds were to seize and hold territory in northern Iran, they could create a buffer zone beneficial to Israel in the West. The historical parallel with Iraq in 2003 is inevitable and frightening. On that occasion, the American military victory was quick. But the post-conflict phase has revealed that overthrowing a regime is infinitely easier than building a stable state in its place. Iraq descended into a sectarian war that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, and to this day has failed to establish a functioning democracy. The global economic implications of this scenario are equally serious. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz affects no less than 20% of the world's oil supply. If this closure continues for months, which is entirely possible in a long conflict, the world will face an energy crisis of historic proportions. Oil prices could reach record levels, fueling global inflation, recession in emerging economies, and political instability in countries dependent on cheap oil. Domestically, the U.S. will face increasing political pressure as casualties pile up. American forces suffered attacks on at least 27 bases in the Middle East. Every American soldier killed on Arab soil adds fuel to the domestic opposition. Recent American history, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, suggests that long-running wars without clear, achievable goals tend to consume presidencies and turn military victories into political defeats. Meanwhile, China and Russia are watching the conflict with calculated attention. Both strategically benefit from American attrition. Every dollar spent in the Middle East is a dollar that does not go to the Indo-Pacific, where China is expanding its influence. The Iran war may inadvertently be the greatest strategic gift Washington has ever offered Beijing. The darkest scenario, then, is not the war we see. It's the one that comes later when the spotlights go out and the world realizes that no one has a clear plan for the next day. We have reached the end of this analysis, but far from the end of the story it tells. Let's recap what we learned. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran, an attack that killed Supreme Leader Khamenei, destroyed dozens of military and nuclear facilities, and closed the Strait of Hormuz, affecting 20% of the world's oil. Iran responded with hundreds of missiles and drones targeting American bases in 9 Middle Eastern countries. But what this video tried to show is that the events of February 28th did not begin on February 28th. They are the result of decades of proxy conflict, of a U.S.-Israeli alliance with not always identical goals, of an Iranian nuclear program that served as justification and pretext, and, crucially, of a diplomatic negotiation that was destroyed at the very moment it seemed to work. The question that gives this video its title, was the U.S. led to war by Israel? There is no simple yes or no answer. What we can safely say is that Israel had much clearer and more radical strategic objectives than the United States in this conflict. That Israel was fiercely opposed to negotiations that seemed to produce results. And that the chronology of events, imminent agreement on February 27th, war on February 28th, raises questions that historians of the future will debate for decades. What is clear is that geopolitics is rarely about the event we see on the news. It's about the long-term strategic processes that make that event inevitable, or that deliberately constructed. Many of the decisions that shape the world are understood only years or decades after they are made. Are we facing a passing event, yet another crisis in the turbulent Middle East, or the beginning of a profound reconfiguration of the global balance of power? Will we look at February 2026 in 10 years the same way as we look at August 1914 today, the month in which the world entered a war that no one wanted and from which no one could get out? We don't have all the answers, but asking the right questions is the first step to understanding the world we live in. If you've made it this far, you already know that geopolitics requires patience, context, and a willingness to question official narratives. Leave it in the comments. Do you believe that the USA acted on its own initiative, or were they instrumentalized by Israel? Your perspective enriches the debate. And if this type of analysis makes sense to you, follow the channel, because the world will not stand still.